Welcome to a story where trust is the rarest coin, and love is earned in fire. Settle in. Clara Tanner held the deed so tightly, the paper bent under her thumb. The lawyer's office smelled of old ink and pipe smoke. Across the desk, Harlan Briggs stood with his hat in his hands and mud on his boots, watching her like she might bolt. He had arrived in Juniper Basin an hour ago, carrying surveying instruments and a story that made her stomach twist. The railroad wanted the land. Her family's land. Willow Ranch sat directly in the path of the new spur line, and without clear proof of ownership, the company would seize it under eminent domain. Her father's death 3 months ago had left the deed in question. Harlan claimed he had been hired to survey the route, but he had proof, documents that might save the ranch or condemn it, depending on whose story the territorial judge believed. She did not trust him. She did not trust anyone anymore, not after the bank scandal that had cost her her reputation and her engagement 6 months ago. The whole town still whispered. Harlan's gaze did not waver. He said, "I have the original survey notes. They show your father bought the land free and clear in '69, but the railroad filed a counterclaim last week. If we do not move fast, you lose everything." Clara's pulse hammered. She said, "Why would you help me? You work for the railroad." Harlan set his hat on the desk. He said, "I did, until I saw what they were willing to do to get that land. I walked away. Now they want me silent." The office door swung open. A man in a dusty black coat stepped inside, his face hard as iron. He said, "Briggs, you were told to leave town." Harlan turned slowly. Clara saw the flash of something dangerous in his eyes, buried under exhaustion. The man in black said, "The company does not appreciate surveyors who change sides. You have until sundown." Harlan said, "I am not going anywhere." The man's hand drifted toward his coat. Clara stepped forward, her voice sharp. She said, "This is a legal matter. You have no authority here." The man looked at her, then at Harlan, then back. He said, "You are the Tanner girl, the one who got fired from the bank. Shame about that scandal. Be a shame if more trouble found you." He left. The door swung shut. Clara's hands shook. Harlan said, "Who was that?" She said, "Railroad enforcer. His name is Drummond. He has been pressuring half the landowners in the basin to sell cheap." Harlan's jaw tightened. He said, "Then we have less time than I thought." Clara looked at the deed in her hand, then at the stranger who had walked into her life with secrets and solutions in equal measure. She said, "Why should I believe you?" Harlan met her eyes. He said, "Because I have nothing left to lose, and because you are the only person in this town who might understand what that feels like." She hated that he was right. The bankruptcy shame still clung to her like smoke. Her father had borrowed money to expand the ranch, and when the bank collapsed under corrupt management, the debt had transferred to a man named Keller, a saloon owner with a reputation for collecting in blood. The debt was not hers, but Keller did not care. He had made it clear she had two choices: pay or marry his nephew. She had chosen neither. She had taken the clerk job to buy time. And then the ledger discrepancy had surfaced. Numbers that did not match, and though she had not stolen a cent, the accusation had been enough. Her engagement had ended the same week. Independence had cost her everything. Harlan rode out to Willow Ranch with her that afternoon. The ride was silent. The ranch sat in a shallow basin surrounded by juniper-covered hills. The house small, but solid. The barn sagging on one side. Clara's younger brother, Ben, had tried to keep things running, but at 16, he was overwhelmed. Harlan dismounted and walked the fence line without asking permission. Clara watched him from the porch, arms crossed. He moved like a man used to hard country, checking posts, measuring distances with his eyes. He said, "You need 40 head to make the drive to the railhead in Cedarville. How many do you have?" She said 23. "And half of them are too young." He nodded. He said, "Then you need partners or you lose the season." She hated the truth in his words. The cattle drive was supposed to happen in 2 weeks. Without it, she could not pay Keller. And without paying Keller, she lost the ranch regardless of the deed. Harlan climbed the porch steps and sat on the top one, dust on his knees. He said, "I can help you finish the drive. I have done it before. But we need to move fast. Drummond will not wait for legal proceedings. If the railroad wants this land, they will find a way to take it." Clara sat beside him, the wood warm under her skirt. She said, "What do you get out of this?" Harlan looked at the hills. He said, "A chance to do one thing right before I disappear." She wanted to ask what he meant, but the sound of hoofbeats cut her off. A rider came up the road, fast. Clara stood. The rider was a woman, older, gray hair under a wide hat. Riding like the devil was behind her. She reined in hard and said, "Clara, Keller is at the land office. He is filing a lien against the ranch. Says your father owed him $800, and he has the note to prove it." Clara's stomach dropped. Harlan stood. He said, "When?" The woman said, 20 minutes ago. "If you do not contest it today, the judge will rule in his favor by default." Clara ran for her horse. Harlan followed. They rode into town at a gallop, the sun dropping toward the hills, dust rising behind them. The land office was a narrow building next to the courthouse. Keller stood inside, a thick man in a brocade vest, smiling at the clerk. Clara pushed through the door, breathless. She said, "That debt was paid. My father settled it 2 years ago." Keller turned, his smile widening. He said, "Show me the receipt." Clara's heart sank. The receipt had been in her father's desk. She had not seen it since the funeral. Keller said, "No receipt means no payment. The note stands." Harlan stepped beside her. He said, "Filing a fraudulent lien is a criminal act." Keller looked him over. He said, "And who are you?" Harlan said, "Someone who knows the law. If that note is real, you will have documentation. Let's see it." Keller's smile thinned. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to the clerk. Harlan took it, read it, and passed it to Clara. The signature looked like her father's, but the ink was too fresh. She said, "This is a forgery." Keller laughed. He said, "Prove it." The clerk looked nervous. He said, "I need to file this, unless there is a formal objection with supporting evidence." Clara had no evidence. Harlan said, "Give us 48 hours. We will bring proof." The clerk hesitated. Keller said, "No. File it now." Harlan leaned over the desk, his voice low and cold. He said, "If you file that lien, I will personally ensure the territorial marshal investigates every loan Keller has made in the past 5 years. I worked with the railroad. I know what fraud looks like. And I know who to tell. The clerk went pale. Keller's face darkened. He said, "You are making a mistake, Briggs." Harlan said, 48 hours. The clerk nodded quickly and set the paper aside. Outside, Clara stopped on the boardwalk, shaking. Harlan said, "We need that receipt." "Where would your father have kept it?" she said. "In his desk." "But I went through everything. It is not there," Harlan said. "Then someone took it." She looked at him. She said, "You think Keller has it?" he said. "Or he knows where it is. Either way, we have 2 days." Clara felt the weight of it pressed down. She said, "Why are you doing this? You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Harlan was quiet for a moment. He said, "I owe a lot of people. This is a start." They walked to the boarding house where Harlan had taken a room. It was a narrow building with peeling paint and a landlady who watched them through the window. Harlan said, "You should go home. I will look into Keller's background. See if I can find something we can use." Clara said, "I am not going home. If we have 2 days, I am not wasting them waiting." He looked at her, something shifting in his tired eyes. He said, "You are stubborn." She said, "I am practical. There is a difference." He almost smiled. He said, "All right. Then we start with the bank records. If your father paid Keller, there might be a ledger entry." Clara's chest tightened. She said, "I cannot go back to the bank. They will not let me in." Harlan said, "Then we go after dark." She stared at him. She said, "You want to break in?" He said, "I want to find the truth. If that requires a window, so be it." Clara felt a wild, reckless thrill she had not felt in months. She said, "If we get caught, they will arrest us." Harlan said, "Then we do not get caught." The plan was insane. It was also the only plan they had. They waited until midnight. The bank sat on the corner of Main Street, dark and locked. Harlan had brought a pry bar and a canvas sack. Clara kept watch while he worked the back window. The lock gave with a soft snap. He climbed inside and reached back to help her through. The interior smelled of paper and dust. Moonlight slanted through the front windows. Clara led him to the records room, her hands steady despite her racing pulse. She knew where the ledgers were kept. She had filed them herself for 2 years. She found the ledger for 1871 and opened it on the floor. Harlan held a shuttered lantern, the beam narrow. Clara ran her finger down the columns. Payments in, payments out, loan settlements. And there in August, a notation. Keller note, $800 paid in full, receipt issued. Her breath caught. She said, "It is here." Harlan leaned closer. He said, "Who signed it?" She squinted at the cramped handwriting. She said, "My father." And the bank manager. The same manager who had accused her of stealing 6 months later. Her stomach turned. She said, "He knew. He knew the debt was paid, and he let Keller file the lien anyway." Harlan said, "Copy the entry. We need proof." Clara pulled a pencil from the desk and wrote the information on a scrap of paper. Outside, a door slammed. Footsteps on the boardwalk. Harlan snapped the lantern shut. They froze. A voice called out, "Who is in there?" Clara recognized it. The night watchman. Harlan grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the back window. The front door rattled. The watchman was trying keys. They climbed through the window and dropped into the alley. Harlan pulled the window shut just as the door opened inside. They ran. They did not stop until they reached the edge of town, gasping in the shadows behind the livery. Clara leaned against the wall, her heart hammering. Harlan said, "You all right?" She nodded. She said, "That was too close." He said, "But we have what we need." She pulled the paper from her pocket. The ink was smudged, but readable. She said, "This proves Keller lied." Harlan said, "It proves the debt was paid. But we still need the receipt to prove the note he filed is fake." Clara's relief faded. She said, "Then we are back where we started." Harlan shook his head. He said, "Not quite. Now we know the bank manager is involved. That gives us leverage." The next morning, Clara rode out to Willow Ranch to check on Ben and the cattle. Harlan went to confront the bank manager. He found him in his office, a thin man with wire spectacles and ink-stained fingers. Harlan closed the door. He said, "I know about the ledger entry. I know you helped Keller forge the lien." The manager went pale. He said, "I do not know what you are talking about." Harlan leaned on the desk. He said, "You can tell me the truth, or I can tell the territorial marshal. Your choice." The manager's hands shook. He said, "Keller paid me. He said no one would get hurt. He just wanted the land." Harlan said, "Where is the receipt?" The manager said, "Keller has it. He took it after Tanner died." He knew Clara would not remember every piece of paper her father kept. Harlan straightened. He said, "If you testify to that, I will keep your name out of it. If you do not, I will make sure you lose everything." The manager nodded, miserable. Harlan left. He met Clara at the ranch that afternoon. She was mending a section of fence, her sleeves rolled up, sweat on her brow. He told her what he had learned. She set down the hammer. She said, "So Keller has the receipt. How do we get it?" Harlan said, "We do not. We make him give it to us." Clara frowned. She said, "How?" He said, "We offer him something he wants more." She said, "Like what?" Harlan said, "Me." Clara stared at him. He said, "Keller knows I worked for the railroad. He thinks I have maps, surveys, insider knowledge about future routes. If I offer to sell him that information, he will meet with me. When he does, you search his office." She said, "That is insane." He said, "It is the only way." She wanted to argue, but she saw the logic. She said, "What if he does not bring the receipt?" Harlan said, "He will. Men like Keller keep their leverage close." The plan went into motion that night. Harlan sent word to Keller through a bartender, offering a meeting at the saloon. Clara waited across the street, hidden in the shadows of the mercantile. Keller arrived with 2 men. Harlan met him at a corner table. Clara watched through the window, her pulse loud in her ears. After 10 minutes, Keller stood and gestured for Harlan to follow him upstairs to his office. Clara moved fast. She crossed the street and slipped through the saloon's side door, up the back stairs. Keller's office was at the end of the hall. She could hear voices inside. She tried the door. Locked. She pulled a hairpin from her braid and worked the lock the way her brother had taught her years ago. The latch gave. She slipped inside and closed the door behind her. The office was cramped, lined with shelves and a heavy desk. She searched the drawers, moving fast and silent. Papers, coins, a pistol, a bottle of whiskey. No receipt. She checked the shelves. A lockbox sat on the top shelf. She pulled it down. It was locked. She pried at it with a hairpin. The lock snapped. Inside, a stack of documents. And there, at the bottom, a receipt signed by her father and the bank manager. Paid in full. She grabbed it and slipped it into her pocket. Footsteps in the hall. She barely had time to close the lockbox and shove it back on the shelf before the door opened. Keller stepped inside, his eyes narrowing. He said, "What are you doing here?" Clara's mind raced. She said, looking for the truth. Keller's face darkened. He said, "You are trespassing. I could have you arrested." Clara backed toward the door. She said, "Try it. I have proof you forged that lien." Keller moved fast, blocking the door. He said, "Give me whatever you took," Clara said. "No." Harlan appeared in the doorway behind Keller, his face hard. He said, "Step aside." Keller turned. He said, "This does not concern you, Briggs." Harlan said, "It does now. Move." Keller reached for the pistol at his belt. Harlan grabbed his wrist and twisted. The gun clattered to the floor. Keller swung. Harlan ducked and drove his shoulder into Keller's chest, slamming him against the wall. Clara ran. Harlan followed. They took the back stairs 2 at a time, Keller shouting behind them. They hit the alley and ran for the horses. They rode hard back to Willow Ranch, not stopping until they were inside the house with the door barred. Clara pulled the receipt from her pocket and set it on the table. Harlan checked the window, then turned. He said, "Keller will come after us." Clara said, "Let him. We have what we need." She looked at the receipt, her father's signature clear in the lamplight. She said, "Thank you." Harlan said, "Do not thank me yet. We still have to get this to the judge, and Keller will do everything he can to stop us." Clara said, "Then we go first thing in the morning." He nodded. He said, "I will stay here tonight. Keep watch." She made coffee while he checked the perimeter. Ben was asleep in the back room. The house was quiet, except for the wind. Clara sat at the table, exhaustion pulling at her. Harlan came back inside and sat across from her. She said, "You never told me why you left the railroad." He was quiet. Then he said, "I found out they were paying men to burn out homesteaders who would not sell. I reported it. They buried the report and told me to keep surveying. I refused. So they fired me and put my name on a list. Now every railroad company in the territory thinks I'm a troublemaker." Clara looked at him. She said, "You gave up your career." He said, "I gave up a lie." She understood. She said, "I know what that costs." He met her eyes. He said, "I know you do." She wanted to say more, but the moment felt too fragile. Instead, she said, "Get some rest." I will take first watch. Harlan shook his head. He said, You have done enough. Sleep. I will wake you if anything happens. She did not argue. She went to her room and lay down fully dressed, the receipt under her pillow. She did not expect to sleep, but exhaustion took her under. She woke to the sound of breaking glass. She bolted upright. Harlan was already at her door. He said, They are here. She grabbed her father's rifle from the corner and followed him to the front room. Firelight flickered outside the window. Torches. Keller's voice called out, Send Briggs out and I will leave the girl alone. Harlan said, Stay inside. Clara said, They will burn the house. Harlan said, Not if I give them what they want. She grabbed his arm. She said, You are not going out there. He looked at her, something fierce and final in his eyes. He said, I told you. I have nothing left to lose. The front door shook under a heavy blow. Harlan pushed Clara toward the back door. He said, Take the receipt and ride to town. Get it to the judge. Do not stop. Do not look back. She said, I am not leaving you. He said, You have to. This is bigger than me. She wanted to scream, but she knew he was right. She took the receipt and ran for the back door. Behind her, the front door splintered. She heard Harlan shout. She heard gunfire. She did not look back. She ran to the barn, saddled her horse, and rode into the night. She reached town at dawn, her horse lathered and blowing. She went straight to the courthouse and demanded to see the judge. The clerk tried to turn her away. She slammed the receipt on his desk and said, This proves Keller lied. File it now, or I will go to the territorial marshal myself. The clerk took the receipt and disappeared into the judge's chambers. Clara waited, shaking. 20 minutes later, the judge emerged, an older man with a gray beard and sharp eyes. He said, This is serious. If Keller filed a fraudulent lien, he will face charges. Where did you get this? Clara said, My father's records. The judge said, I will issue an order nullifying the lien. But you need to bring witnesses. The bank manager, for one. Clara said, He will testify. I will make sure of it. The judge nodded. He said, And Briggs? Where is he? Clara's throat tightened. She said, At my ranch. Keller went after him. The judge's face darkened. He said, I will send the marshal. Clara ran back to her horse and rode hard for Willow Ranch. The sun was climbing. Smoke rose from the direction of the ranch. Her chest felt like it might crack. She pushed the horse harder. She reached the ranch at mid-morning. The house still stood, but the barn was a charred ruin. She dismounted and ran inside. Ben was in the front room, his face pale. He said, Harlan held them off until they gave up. But he is hurt. Clara found Harlan in her father's old room, lying on the bed. His shirt was torn and bloody. A bullet had grazed his ribs. He looked up when she came in. He said, You made it. She said, You are bleeding. He said, I have had worse. She knelt beside him and pulled back the shirt. The wound was not deep, but it needed cleaning. She said, Stay still. She cleaned the wound with water and whiskey. He did not flinch. She tore a strip from an old sheet and wrapped his ribs. Her hands were steady, but her heart was not. she said. You could have died, he said, but I did not. She tied off the bandage and sat back. She said, Why did you do it? He said. Because you needed time, she said. That is not an answer. He looked at her, something raw in his eyes. He said, Because I am tired of running. Because for the first time in a long time, I had something worth fighting for. The words hung between them. Clara could not breathe. She said, Harlan. He said, I know. You do not owe me anything. I do not expect anything. I just needed you to know. She took his hand. She said, I do not want you to leave. He looked at their joined hands. He said, I do not want to leave. But Keller will not stop. And the railroad will not stop. If I stay, I put you in danger, she said. I am already in danger. At least this way I am not alone. He squeezed her hand. He said, All right. Then we finish this together. The marshal arrived that afternoon with 2 deputies. Keller and 3 of his men were arrested. The bank manager testified. The judge nullified the lien and issued a warrant for Keller's arrest on fraud charges. The railroad's claim was delayed pending further investigation. Clara stood on the courthouse steps, the deed in her hand, and felt something close to relief. Harlan stood beside her, his ribs wrapped tight under his shirt. He said, You won, she said. We won. He looked at her. She said, I could not have done this without you. He said, Yes, you could have, but I am glad you did not have to, that the fight was not over. 2 days later, word came that the railroad was sending a new surveyor. And worse, the cattle drive deadline was approaching. Clara had to move 40 head to Cedarville in 5 days or lose the season. Harlan said, I will ride with you. Clara said, You are hurt. He said, I can sit a horse. She said, We do not have enough hands. We need at least 4 riders. Harlan said, Then we find them. They went to the ranchers Clara's father had worked with. Most said no. The railroad had made it clear that helping Clara meant trouble. But 2 men agreed, a father and son who owed Clara's father a debt. It would have to be enough. They gathered the cattle at dawn, 23 head, most of them young and skittish. Ben rode drag. Harlan and the father rode flank. The son rode point with Clara. It was a 3-day drive across open country, following the old trail through the hills and down into the valley where the railhead sat. The first day went smooth. The cattle moved slow but steady. They camped that night in a draw with good grass and water. Clara sat by the fire, her body aching. Harlan sat beside her. He said, You are doing fine. She said, We are behind schedule. He said, We will make it up tomorrow. The second day brought trouble. A storm rolled in from the west, dark and fast. The cattle spooked. 2 steers broke from the herd and ran. Ben and the son went after them. Clara and Harlan pushed the rest of the herd into a tight bunch. The rain hit hard, cold and blinding. Clara could barely see. Lightning cracked. The cattle bolted. Harlan shouted, Stay with them. Clara rode hard, her horse slipping in the mud. She saw a steer veer toward a gully. She cut it off, turning it back. The herd slowed. The rain eased. She counted heads. 21. They had lost 2. Harlan rode up beside her, soaked and breathing hard. He said, "We cannot go back for them. We do not have time." Clara nodded. She said, "Keep moving." They camped that night without a fire. The wood was too wet. Clara sat under a tarp with Harlan, shivering. He pulled a blanket around both of them. She leaned against him without thinking. He said, "You are tougher than most men I have worked with." She said, "I do not feel tough." He said, "Tough is not about how you feel. It is about what you do when you feel like quitting." She looked up at him. She said, "Do you ever feel like quitting?" He said, "Every day. But then I think about what I would be quitting on. And I keep going." She said, "What do you think about?" He said, "Right now? You." Her breath caught. She said, "Harlan." He said, "I know. This is not the time. But I needed you to know." She took his hand under the blanket. She said, "I am glad you are here." He said, "So am I." They sat like that until the rain stopped and the stars came out. The third day was brutal. The trail turned rough, cutting through rocky hills. One of the steers went lame. They had to leave it. Clara felt each loss like a knife. They reached Cedarville at dusk with 19 head. It was not enough to cover the full debt, but it was enough to buy time. Clara sold the cattle to a buyer at the railhead. The money went straight to the bank to settle part of what her father owed. It was not freedom, but it was survival. Harlan stood beside her as the buyer counted out the bills. He said, "You did it." She said, "We did it." He said, "What now?" She did not have an answer. The ranch was safe for now, but the future was uncertain. The railroad still wanted the land. Keller was in jail, but his men were not. And Harlan was still a man with a target on his back. That night, they stayed in a boarding house in Cedarville. Clara could not sleep. She went downstairs and found Harlan on the porch, looking at the rail yard. She said, "You are leaving, or not you?" He turned. He said, "I have to. The railroad knows where I am. If I stay, they will come after you next." She said, "I can handle it." He said, "I know you can. But you should not have to." She walked to the rail and stood beside him. She said, "What if I asked you to stay?" He looked at her. He said, "I would stay." She said, "Even if it means more trouble?" He said, "Trouble does not scare me. Losing you does." The words cracked something open in her chest. She said, "Then do not leave." He turned to face her. He said, "Clara, I have nothing. No job, no money, no future. I am a man the railroad wants gone. You deserve better." She stepped closer. She said, "I do not want better. I want you." He searched her face. He said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I have never been more sure of anything." He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was desperate and real and full of everything they had been holding back. When they pulled apart, she was shaking. He said, "I will stay. But only if you let me help. Let me work the ranch. Let me stand with you when the railroad comes back. Let me be more than a hired hand." She said, "What are you asking?" He said, "Marry me. Not because you owe me, not because you need protection, but because I love you, and I want to build something that lasts." She said, "Yes." The wedding was small. The preacher in Juniper Basin married them in his front room with Ben and the 2 ranch hands as witnesses. Clara wore her mother's dress, simple and white. Harlan wore a clean shirt and his best hat. They said their vows with the morning light slanting through the window. Afterward, they rode back to Willow Ranch together. The barn was still a ruin, but the house stood solid. They had work ahead, a hard season, and enemies who had not forgotten. But they had each other. And that, Clara thought, was more than she had ever expected to have. 3 weeks later, a man arrived from the territorial capital. He was a lawyer, older, with a briefcase and a letter from the Land Commission. He said the railroad's claim had been reviewed and denied. The original survey notes Harlan had provided, combined with Clara's deed and the testimony about Keller's fraud, had been enough. Willow Ranch was secure. Clara stood on the porch with Harlan and read the letter twice. She said, "It is over." Harlan said, "For now." She looked at him. She said, "You think they will try again?" He said, "Maybe. But next time, we will be ready." He was right. 2 months later, another surveyor arrived, this one honest and apologetic. He measured the land and confirmed the boundaries. The railroad rerouted the spur line 5 miles south. It cost them time and money, but it was cheaper than a legal fight they could not win. Clara watched the surveyor leave and felt something she had not felt in a year. Peace. Harlan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. He said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "That we won." He said, "We did." She turned in his arms. She said, "What do we do now?" He smiled. He said, "We build." They rebuilt the barn over the summer. Ben helped, and so did the neighbors who had finally stopped whispering. The cattle herd grew. Clara kept the books. Harlan worked the land. They hired 2 hands and brought in a good harvest. The debt to Keller was settled when his assets were seized and auctioned. The bank appointed a new manager. Clara's name was cleared. It did not happen overnight, but slowly, the town began to remember her as something other than the girl who had been accused. She became the woman who had fought the railroad and won. Winter came hard. Snow covered the basin, and the hills turned white. Clara stood at the window one morning, watching Harlan chop wood in the yard. She was 3 months along, though she had not told him yet. She wanted to wait for the right moment. That evening, they sat by the fire. He said, "You have been quiet today." She said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her. She said, "I am pregnant." He went still. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. He said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I am sure." He said, "When?" She said, "Late spring, if I am counting right." He kissed her forehead. He said, "We are going to need a bigger house." They started planning. Harlan drew up plans for an addition, 2 more rooms and a larger kitchen. Clara sewed blankets and curtains. Ben teased them both. The neighbors brought gifts, baby clothes, and advice. The winter passed slow and cold, but inside the house, there was warmth. In March, a letter arrived from the territorial marshal. Keller had been sentenced to 5 years for fraud and attempted arson. Drummond, the railroad enforcer, had been arrested in another territory on similar charges. The threats were gone. Clara felt the weight she had been carrying lift. The baby came in May, a girl with dark hair and Harlan's eyes. They named her Rose, after Clara's mother. Clara held her in the rocking chair by the window and watched the sun rise over the basin. Harlan sat beside her, his hand on her shoulder. He said, "She is perfect." Clara said, "She is ours." He said, "We made it." She looked up at him. She said, "We did." He kissed her temple. He said, "I love you." She said, "I love you too." It was not the life she had expected. It was harder and messier and more uncertain. But it was real. And it was theirs. And that was enough. A year later, the railroad built a station in Juniper Basin. The town grew. New families arrived. Willow Ranch became known as one of the most successful operations in the basin. Clara and Harlan hired more hands and expanded the herd. Ben married a girl from town and started his own spread on the north section of the ranch. Rose learned to walk in the front yard, chasing chickens and laughing. Life was not easy, but it was good. On quiet evenings, Clara and Harlan sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the hills. He said, "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing all of this?" She said, "Every day." He said, "I am glad we did not." She leaned against him. She said, "So am I." The deed that had nearly destroyed them now hung framed in the front room, a reminder of what they had fought for. The marriage that had started as a desperate bargain had become the strongest thing Clara had ever known. Trust, she learned, was not given. It was earned. One hard day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of standing together when it would have been easier to run. And love was not a rescue. It was a partnership forged in fire and built on honesty. She had learned to deserve peace, and so had he. Together, they had found it, not in safety, not in certainty, but in each other, and in the life they had built with their own hands under the wide western sky.